When people come here from certain countries and they don't understand what's involved with a police stop, maybe they have been pulled over for driving too fast or running a red light.
Well, I have an interesting story about that. And that happened to one of Japanese students at our university. And he was driving a car. He had passed his, he had gotten his license here in the United States, and he could drive perfectly fine. And one day he was driving, and he didn't quite stop at a stop sign. In other words, he did what we call kind of a rolling stop, which actually we all do sometimes. But it happened that there was a policeman right behind him, and so the policeman put on the the lights and the siren, and so the Japanese guy was really nervous, and he pulled over, and he had no idea what he had done. And so what he did was he immediately got out of the car. And the policeman, in the United States, we don't get out of the car when the policeman stops us. And so the policeman was pretty rough with the guy, because it's not really following the law to get out of the car, but the Japanese guy didn't know this. And so the policeman put him up beside the car, turned him around, and put his hands behind his back. And why did you get out of the car? And it was very rough, and the student was pretty nervous and actually really upset. But the only problem was that he was trying to show respect to the policeman by getting out of the car. But in the United States, of course, we're not supposed to get out of the car when the police stops us. And it was just a matter of not having that information.
And in fact, you can understand the policeman's alarm.
Right, because the policeman didn't know who the person was who he stopped. I mean, he might have had a gun, or he might have, been ready to run away, or could have done harm to the policeman. So from both perspectives, there was just a lack of an understanding.
Lorena, have you had any experience with people from other countries who come here and they're used to the police being completely corrupt, used to taking bribes? In other words, they pull people over and then they'll let them go if they pay them a certain amount of money?
I have interacted with many people from the countries where that is common, but in my experience, most of the people from those countries who come here, somehow they get the information that we do it different here. I've never had that experience where they actually try to give a bribe or something, because for some reason they always seem to know that's not done here.
Well, it is a problem with quite a few people coming from Latin America, but it's also surprising to me that how many of them don't know it. But you told me that you're working with people who are more highly educated normally, and so I think they're used to gathering more information.
They do know how to gather information and how to ask questions. I mean, of course, they'll still make mistakes. And speaking of making mistakes, let me just emphasize again that I really, really think that the attitude of having a good sense of humor and not worrying about making mistakes really is important for living in a different country, visiting a different country, learning a different language.
So let's say a lot of our students decide, even in 6th grade or 8th grade, there are programs out there that will let kids go for a while. Well, you know a lot about them, I'm sure. They need to be brave, like you were saying.
Yeah, and they need to be willing to, make mistakes. And in order to make a mistake, you have to speak. So it's been my experience that people who are outgoing and tend to speak up more, and that they just learn faster.
What about giving compliments?
Giving compliments, I can't say much about that.
What about when you're talking about yourself, if you're going to be discussing yourself? I don't know if it's just in terms of job interviews, but
when you're that's another really cultural thing, and it does affect job interviews a lot, but it also affects for example, if you're in school and you're working on a project, and maybe you have a group project that you're working on, the way that you communicate the work that you've done to add to this project, for example, the work that you personally have done, will affect how the other people in your group think about you, and will also affect how your teacher thinks about you. And for example, when you get older and maybe do a job interview, if you're from the United States, in the United States, we expect that you will be willing to tell about your strengths, tell about the positive things that you've done in the past, and how those things can really be a good positive influence at the job that you're applying for. Whereas in other countries, it may be somewhat like bragging. If it may feel like those people are bragging by telling all the good things that they've done on the job. So a kind of cultural difference as far as job interviews or promoting your own work, that kind of thing, you can get into a lot of trouble. And what do I mean by a lot of trouble? Is that what you're going to ask?
Go ahead.
Well, let's say, for example, two people are trying to get the same job, or maybe trying to get accepted at a university, a very competitive university, and they go for an interview. Well, the person who's interviewing them doesn't know all the things about them, and it's expected here in the United States that the interviewee will be willing and ready to give all kinds of examples and all kinds of information about what they've done in the past, the good things that they've done. And to us, this is not, us here in the United States, it's not a form of bragging, it's more of a form of promoting yourself in an appropriate way. But that appropriate way is a lot different, for example, in Asian countries.
What do Asians notice about the U.S.?
Oh, they notice some funny things. And this is an interesting question because we test all of our incoming students each fall, and so I just recently did that. And one of the questions that we asked is, were you surprised about anything in the United States? And so it's very funny because a lot of people from China, for example, almost everyone says, yes, I'm very surprised about how blue the sky is here in the United States. And the reason they say that is that most of them come from large cities, and large cities in China have a lot of smog and pollution, so they don't often see the blue sky. And they also say, for example, we live near St. Louis, which is considered kind of a mid-sized city here in the United States, but they talk about how few people there are in the United States, when you go out on the street. They say, well, I'm used to walking, and people from India also, I'm used to every time I go out, I see at least 100 or 200 people. And so they walk around St. Louis and maybe only see 4 or 5 people at once on a block, and so that seems like there aren't many people here. And they also say that they see a lot of animals, and by animals they mean like squirrels and birds, and so that those are some surprising things that they tell me.
But we know there are a lot of people in St. Louis. They just don't see them, outside?
Right, and that's another thing that people are surprised about, especially people from Europe. Tend to go out a lot at night. For example, when they finish their work, they'll go out and maybe eat at a restaurant in the summer, outside, on the street. They'll spend a lot of time at their friends' homes, or maybe out with their friends. Whereas they have a funny thing. They say, well, in the United States, after 6 o'clock, everyone shuts their door and goes into their house.
Well, as a matter of fact, most people probably are getting ready to eat supper about then. If they haven't eaten at 5, probably most people don't eat past 7, do they?
No. We tend to eat earlier than maybe people from Latin America, too.
Lorinda, say something about that, because when you go to another country, you got to be ready to change your habits. You can't say, I'm hungry, I want to eat now.
That's right. You can, but it won't get you very far. Yeah, so things like, I think you're talking about times that people expect to eat. Those are really different too, and it's funny. This is one way where in the United States we're more like the people in Asia, that we would tend to eat dinner maybe about 6 o'clock, something like that, in the evening. Whereas in Latin America and in some European countries, especially Italy, for example, people might tend to eat dinner, really quite late I mean, I say quite late because for me it's quite late. That's kind of funny because that's a cultural thing, but for them it's normal, so they would eat dinner maybe 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock at night. And I would be hungry by then.
And what about when people have to adjust to food?
Mm-hmm.
You said something, the Latin Americans don't have to make too much of an adjustment?
Not so much. Well, I'm sure that they do have to make an adjustment, sure. I mean, because obviously anyone who's traveled in Latin America knows that the food is different, but it's not as different as, for example, some countries in Asia. It's a lot more different than the United States.